The Wyoming sun was a bleeding wound in the October sky. It smeared rust and blood across the prairie as a mean, dry wind kicked up the scent of sage and dust. Samuel Hartley stood at the edge of a hole in the ground, a fresh hole. Inside was his father, and with him, the last ounce of strength in the Hartley name. 19 years old, and now master of 800 acres of unforgiving dirt that wanted him dead. The land was a flat, brown ocean, and he was drowning in it. He turned back toward the ranch house, each step a dead weight. The house his father built stood tired, shingles curled like old fingernails, walls cracked and faded. The barn next to it leaned hard to the east, like it had given up fighting the wind. Pride and fear were two snakes wrestling in his gut. This was his inheritance, his curse. Boy ain't got the backbone for it. The voice sliced through the wind. Jake Morrison, a man built like a bulldog, reined in his horse. He wanted to make sure Samuel heard it, every single word. Give it 6 months. That land will be up for sale. Mark me. Samuel's jaw went tight as a fist. Morrison's words were like burrs, digging under his skin. He didn't answer. He just walked. But the doubt, it stuck to him like the dust on his boots. He shoved the groaning barn door open. The familiar smell of hay and horse sweat hit him, but it brought no comfort. Only a sharp, hollow reminder of the man who was gone. He leaned over the water trough and saw his reflection. A boy. A lean, uncertain boy trying to fill the shadow of a giant. And that's when he heard it. "You're him, aren't you? The Hartley boy." The voice came from the shadows of the entrance. He spun around. A woman stood there, a silhouette against the dying light. She wore a dusty brown cloak, the kind that had seen too many miles. As she stepped forward, the light caught her face. Dark hair pinned tight, and her eyes. Her eyes were the color of green glass from a broken bottle, sharp, weary, and holding secrets far older than her years. "Yes, ma'am, Samuel Hartley," he said, trying to make his voice sound deeper than it was. "Can I help you?" "I'm Mrs. Catherine Dalton." Her voice was low, tired but firm. "I've come a long way. I need shelter for the night. A corner of your barn is all I ask. I can pay." Samuel shifted on his feet. A woman traveling alone out here? That was trouble walking. It wasn't proper. His mind screamed at him to say no. "There's a boarding house in town, ma'am. Mrs. Garrett's place." Her tone went cold. "I just came from town. Mrs. Garrett made it clear her rooms aren't for women of uncertain reputation." The words hung in the air between them. Samuel knew the talk. Widows left with nothing, forced to do anything to survive. His mother would have slammed the door in her face. But his father always said you measure a man by the kindness he shows to those the world has kicked down. "The barn's warm enough," Samuel said, the words tasting strange in his mouth. "Fresh straw in the loft. I'll get you blankets." Something flickered in those green eyes. Surprise? Gratitude? He couldn't tell. "You're kinder than most, Mr. Hartley." As he walked to the house to get the blankets, Jake Morrison's voice echoed in his head. "Fool boy, letting a strange woman under your roof?" His father would have warned him too. But when he got back, she'd already made a nest in the hay, moving with a quiet purpose that unnerved him. He brought her bread, dried beef, and a canteen. Her eyes softened just a little. "You knew my father?" he asked. "Only by reputation," she said, her gaze fixed on his face. "They say he was a fair man, even to folks most people overlooked." She paused, her eyes searching his. "I wonder if the son takes after the father." Before he could answer, she looked away. "I suppose we'll find out." That night, Samuel sat at the kitchen table, staring at numbers he didn't understand. Debts, bills, wages he couldn't pay. The ranch was bleeding out, and he didn't know how to stop it. His mind kept drifting to the woman in the barn. A stranger, a risk, a spark of something he couldn't name in the suffocating darkness of his grief. Sleep didn't come easy. He dreamed of his father, not as the strong man he remembered, but as a pale ghost whispering from the dirt. "It's not the land that'll test you, boy. It's the choices you make on it." He woke to the sound of hoofbeats, not his horses, riders. He stepped onto the porch just as the sun was cracking the horizon. Jake Morrison and his two sons sat on their horses, spread out like a pack of wolves. Their smiles were all teeth. "Morning, Samuel," Jake drawled. "Heard you had a visitor." Samuel's face was a stone mask. "Not your concern, Mr. Morrison." "Everything's everyone's concern out here." Morrison leaned forward, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Your father understood that. Understood the importance of standards. Housing drifters, women like that. It speaks to poor judgment." "You rode onto my land uninvited," Samuel shot back. "That speaks to poor judgment." Morrison's face went dark. He turned his horse with a sneer. "You're young, boy. You'll make mistakes. But mistakes out here, they got consequences. You remember that?" They rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and menace hanging in the air. Samuel's heart was hammering against his ribs. He'd just picked a fight with the most powerful man in the county, over a complete stranger. And then he saw her. Catherine Dalton was standing in the barn doorway. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes told him everything. She'd heard it all. "I'll be on my way," she said, her voice flat. "I've brought you enough trouble." He should have let her go. He should have said yes, get out, leave me alone. But the defiance, the anger at Morrison, it burned too hot. "The day I let Jake Morrison decide who I give shelter to," Samuel said, his voice shaking with a strength he didn't know he had, "is the day I don't deserve this land." For the first time, a real smile touched her lips. It was faint, but it was there. "5 nights," she said softly. "Give me 5 nights shelter, Mr. Hartley. I'll work for my keep. Cooking, mending, anything. After that, I swear I'll be gone." He knew it was a mistake. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse. But something in her eyes, a mix of fierce pride and raw desperation, made the choice for him. 5 nights, he said. And just like that, Samuel Hartley sealed his fate. He had no idea that those 5 nights wouldn't just change his life. They would unravel a secret that had been buried for years, a secret that would cost more blood than he could ever imagine. The clock was ticking, and trouble was on its way. The first day passed in a haze of sweat and splintered wood. Samuel threw himself into the work, mending fences that were barely standing, clearing troughs choked with mud. He worked until his muscles screamed, trying to sweat out the poison of Morrison's threat and the unsettling presence of the woman in his house. But every time he looked up from his work, his eyes were drawn back to the house, to the windows where he could sometimes see her moving, a quiet shadow in his father's home. By sundown, he was exhausted. But when he walked inside, the air was different. It smelled of coffee and beans and fresh biscuits, scents he hadn't smelled in months. Catherine was at the stove, sleeves rolled up, her face flushed from the heat. She moved around the kitchen like she owned it, like she'd been there for 20 years. "You'll spoil me," he grumbled, trying to sound annoyed. But the first bite of warm biscuit melted the anger right out of him. "Unlikely," she said with that ghost of a smile. "But a man needs a proper meal if he's going to run a ranch." Her voice was practical, but there was a warmth in it that made him feel strange, uneasy. That evening, the sky turned ugly. The clouds rolled in from the mountains, thick and black, and by dusk the first clap of thunder shook the house so hard the windows rattled in their frames. The wind howled like a hungry animal. Samuel glanced toward the barn, a knot tightening in his stomach. "The roof leaks," Catherine said, not even looking at him. She was staring out the window at the storm. "I noticed last night. I'll not stay there in this." He hesitated. The right thing to do, the proper thing, was to tell her to ride for town. But the thought of sending anyone, even a stranger, out into that monster of a storm felt wrong. It felt cruel. "There's a room upstairs," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "My mother's sewing room. It's small, but it's dry. You can use it." Her green eyes met his, and for a second that stretched on forever, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, a warning. Then she just nodded. The storm broke, and it was a fury. Lightning tore the night open, and the thunder was a constant, deafening roar. Samuel paced the downstairs hall, restless, every crash of thunder making him jump. He could hear her moving around upstairs, the soft creak of the floorboards. A woman was sleeping in his mother's room, A woman with a past she wouldn't talk about and eyes that saw right through him. He tried to sleep, but the storm and the thoughts in his head wouldn't let him. Near midnight, a cry cut through the thunder. A sharp, terrified sound. He was at her door in a heartbeat, pushing it open without thinking. She was sitting bolt upright in the narrow bed, clutching the quilt to her chest, her face bone white in the flashes of lightning. "It's just the storm," she said, but her voice was trembling so badly she could barely get the words out. "When my husband, when Robert died, it was a storm just like this. Every time the thunder claps, it feels like the door breaking down all over again." He didn't know what came over him. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed. It wasn't proper, it wasn't right, but he did it anyway. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." A broken, shaky laugh escaped her lips. "You don't know what men like that are capable of." "Then tell me," he urged, his voice soft. Her eyes glistened in the lamplight. She took a shuddering breath. 3 men. They came for Robert's debts. Said he owed them money from a card game. He didn't. They didn't care. They killed him. Right there in front of me." Her voice cracked. "One of them, he tried to, and She couldn't finish. The words choked her. "I found Robert's derringer in the nightstand drawer. I shot him. The other 2, they ran." She looked at him, her eyes wide with a horror that would never leave her. "But I still see his face. Every time the thunder rolls, I see his face." Samuel's heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. He should have gotten up, left the room, put some distance between them. Instead, he reached out and took her hand. It was ice cold. "You did what you had to do." "Did I?" Her voice was a whisper. "I took a man's life." He squeezed her hand tighter. "You survived. That's what matters." Her eyes softened and the terror in them faded just a little. She lifted her free hand slowly, and her fingers brushed against his cheek. The touch was feather light, but it sent a jolt through him. It was tender, but it was something more. A dangerous closeness. Another flash of lightning lit up her face, tracing the lines of exhaustion and fear. But underneath it, he saw something else. A fierce strength, the look of a survivor. "Catherine," he whispered, and saying her name felt like crossing a line he could never uncross. "If you were older," she murmured, her thumb stroking his skin, "you'd know this is a mistake." "I'm old enough," he said, his voice rough with a frustration he didn't understand. "Old enough to run this ranch. Old enough to face Morrison. Old enough to know what I feel." She gave him a sad, knowing smile. "Then prove it, by being smart enough to see tomorrow." The thunder rolled again, but this time Samuel didn't flinch. He sat there with her, in the dark, their hands locked together as the storm raged outside. Nothing more happened. But when the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, he knew that the storm hadn't just broken over the prairie. It had broken inside him, too. He was no longer just a boy haunted by his father's ghost. He was a man, sitting beside a woman haunted by her own. And for the first time, he felt something more than just the weight of the land. He felt the fire of something worth fighting for. But he had no idea the real fight hadn't even started. And the man she shot? His story was far from over. The morning after the storm was quiet. Too quiet. The air was washed clean, and the sky was a perfect, aching blue. But Samuel felt like he was holding his breath. Trouble hadn't passed. It was just circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. It struck at midday. A cloud of dust on the horizon turned into riders. A lot of them. Jake Morrison was in the lead. But this time, he wasn't alone. The sheriff was with him, a tired-looking man named Wallace with eyes that had seen too much. And behind them, a dozen more men, all armed, all with hard faces. They looked less like a posse and more like a lynch mob. They pulled up in front of his porch, a line of silent judgment. "Morning, boy," Morrison said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "Words reached us. Seems your house guest has a past." Sheriff Wallace's gaze was steady. He ignored Morrison and looked straight at Samuel. "Is Mrs. Catherine Dalton inside?" Before Samuel could lie or fight or do something stupid, the front door opened. Catherine stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing her traveling cloak again, her hair pinned up neatly. Her face was a calm, pale mask, but Samuel could see her hands, hidden in the folds of her cloak, were trembling. "I'm Catherine Dalton," she said, her voice clear and strong. "What do you want, Sheriff?" "There's talk," Wallace said, his voice careful. "Talk from Kansas, about a man named Carl Hutchkins, shot dead. His brothers are saying it wasn't self-defense. They're saying it was murder." Samuel's gut twisted into a cold knot. This was it. The consequences Morrison warned him about. But Catherine didn't flinch. "Carl Hutchkins and his friends broke into my home after they killed my husband. He attacked me. I defended myself. A U.S. Marshal looked into it and cleared me of any wrongdoing." Morrison let out a cruel laugh. "So you admit it. You leave a trail of dead men wherever you go. Fits the reputation." "That's enough, Morrison," Samuel snapped, stepping in front of Catherine. "You've got no right." "No right?" Morrison barked. "I got every right when a fool boy's choices put this whole county at risk. You're harboring a killer, and sooner or later, the Hutchkins brothers will come looking for their own justice. And they won't care who gets caught in the crossfire." "That's enough," the sheriff said, raising a hand. "For now, she's not under arrest, not unless I get a warrant from Kansas." He looked at Catherine, and his eyes were hard. "But those brothers, they have money, and they have a long reach. They won't let this go." Morrison wasn't done. He leaned over his saddle horn, his eyes glinting with triumph. "Warrant or not, your time is running out, boy. That bank loan your father took out? It's due in 4 days. And when you can't pay it, and we both know you can't, the bank will sell this land straight to me. This will all be mine. All because you couldn't tell the difference between charity and a snake in your house." The rage in Samuel's chest was a physical thing. He wanted to drag Morrison off his horse, but before he could move, Catherine put a hand on his arm. Her touch was light, but it held him in place. Her voice cut through the tension, quiet but firm. "I'll be here 3 more days, Sheriff. Then I'll be on my way. That was my bargain with Mr. Hartley." "3 days," Morrison sneered. "A lot can happen in 3 days." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his mob thundering behind him. The silence they left was suffocating. Samuel felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. He turned to Catherine. Her resolve was starting to crumble. "You have to make me leave," she whispered, her voice desperate, "before he takes everything from you." He looked at the woman beside him, at the fear and the fight in her eyes. He thought of Morrison's sneer, of his father's grave, and he made a choice. "No," he said, his voice low and steady. "Let him try." But that night, as they sat in the dim lamplight, a new kind of fear began to creep in. Catherine was quieter than ever. She kept looking toward the door, as if expecting it to splinter open at any moment. "He said my time was running out," Samuel said, mostly to himself. 4 days. How did he know the exact day? Catherine looked up, her green eyes sharp. "Maybe he's just guessing." "No," Samuel shook his head. "He knew. The banker, Mr. Abernathy, he's a friend of Morrison's. They play cards together." The pieces started clicking into place, forming a dark and ugly picture. "My father, he hated borrowing money. He wouldn't have taken that loan unless he was desperate." "What was it for?" she asked softly. "Seed, supplies, a new bull. The ranch was struggling even before he got sick." Samuel ran a hand through his hair. "The sickness came on so fast. 1 week he was fine. The next he could barely get out of bed. The doctors said it was a fever of the lungs." He fell silent, the memory still too raw. He'd never questioned it, never thought to. But now, "Samuel," Catherine said, her voice barely a whisper, "when the Hutchkins brothers came for my husband, they said he owed them money. But my Robert, he didn't gamble. He didn't drink. He was a good man. It was a lie. It was just an excuse to take what we had." He looked at her, and a terrifying thought began to form in his mind. A thought so dark he was afraid to even think it. A powerful man who wants your land. A sudden debt. A sickness that comes out of nowhere. It couldn't be. It was just grief and fear talking. But as he looked into Catherine's eyes, he saw the same terrible question reflected there. They were both survivors of a sudden, tragic loss. And maybe, just maybe, neither of them had been an accident. The thought was a cold poison, seeping into him. Morrison didn't just want his land. He may have already killed for it once. And now Samuel had just given him another reason to finish the job. He wasn't just fighting for his home. He was fighting a murderer. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. The next 2 days were a blur of frantic work and watchful paranoia. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Samuel worked from sunup to sundown, trying to do the impossible, get the ranch into some kind of shape, find some way to pay a debt that was designed to be impossible to pay. He felt like a man trying to patch a sinking ship with his bare hands. Catherine worked alongside him. She mended his clothes, cooked meals that put strength back into his bones, and cleaned the dusty, grief-stricken house until it started to feel like a home again. They didn't talk much. They didn't have to. A silent understanding had grown between them, a bond forged in shared danger. He'd catch her watching him from the porch, her rifle resting across her lap, her eyes scanning the horizon. She was standing guard. For him. On the third night, the night before the loan was due, the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. They sat at the kitchen table, the ledger book open between them. The numbers were a death sentence. There was no way, no hope. "It's over," Samuel said, the words tasting like ash. "He's won." "No," Catherine said, her voice fierce. She reached across the table and took his hand. "We don't know that yet. There has to be a way." "There isn't. I've been over it 100 times. The cattle won't be ready for market for another 2 months. I have nothing. Nothing but this land, and tomorrow, it won't even be mine." "Then we need to find something," she insisted. "Your father, did he keep records? A journal? Anything?" Samuel shook his head. "Just these ledgers." Then he stopped. He remembered something. A small locked box his father kept in the bottom drawer of his desk. He'd told Samuel it was just old family papers, nothing important. He'd never had a reason to look inside. He retrieved the box. It was old, made of dark wood, with a simple iron lock. The key was on his father's ring, which Samuel now carried. His hand trembled as he slid the key into the lock and turned. Inside, beneath a stack of yellowed deeds and birth certificates, was a small leather-bound journal. His father's handwriting filled the pages. Samuel started to read, his heart pounding with every word. It started with notes about the ranch, the cattle, the weather. But then the entries changed. They became darker, more secretive. Morrison came by again today, made another offer for the west pasture, says it's just for grazing. He's a liar. I saw his men out there with surveying equipment. He's looking for something. A few pages later, the drought is bad. Lost 3 calves this week. Morrison knows I'm in trouble. He's circling. He offered to co-sign a loan. Said it was a neighborly gesture. Trusting that man is like trusting a rattlesnake. Then the final entries, from the week before he got sick. The handwriting was shaky. I know what he's after. The old spring, the one my grandfather told me never to speak of. It's not just water. There's something else in that water. Something that shines. He must have found out somehow. I followed him. He met with men from the railroad. They're planning to bring the line through here, right through the west pasture. This land will be worth a fortune. He won't stop at anything to get it. I had to take the loan. I had no choice, but I pray I live long enough to pay it back. The last entry was just 3 words. The water tastes wrong. Samuel stared at the page, the blood draining from his face. The water. The ranch had 2 wells, one for the house and an older one for the cattle troughs, closer to the west pasture. His father always drank from the troughs when he was out working. Said it was quicker. The same troughs filled by the old spring. It wasn't a fever. It wasn't sickness. It was poison. Slow, patient murder. He looked up at Catherine, his eyes filled with a horror and a rage so profound he could barely breathe. "He killed him," he whispered. "Morrison poisoned my father for this land." Catherine's face was pale. She reached out and placed her hand over the journal. "Samuel, the man I shot, Carl Hutchkins. He wasn't a drifter. He worked for the railroad." The room went silent. The pieces didn't just click into place. They slammed together with the force of a physical blow. It was all connected. The railroad, the land, Morrison, the Hutchkins brothers. Her husband hadn't died over a card game. He must have known something. Something about the railroad's plans. Something that made him a threat. And they had sent the Hutchins brothers to silence him. Catherine hadn't just stumbled into his life by accident. Fate, or something darker, had brought her here. She wasn't just a woman running from her past. She was a witness. The only other person alive who knew a piece of the truth. And the men who wanted that truth buried were coming for them both. "The loan is due tomorrow at noon," Samuel said, his voice deadly calm. "He'll expect me to be at the bank in town, begging for an extension. That's when he'll make his move, when the ranch is empty." "But we won't be there," Catherine said, her eyes glinting with a hard, dangerous light. "No," Samuel agreed, closing the journal. "We won't." He was no longer a boy grieving his father. He was a son hunting his father's killer. The ranch wasn't just a piece of land anymore. It was a battleground. And tomorrow at dawn, the war would begin. He had one day to save his home, avenge his father, and protect the woman who had stumbled into the heart of his family's darkest secret. And he had no idea that Morrison wasn't the only enemy hiding in plain sight. The air before dawn was cold and still, thick with unspoken promises of violence. The world was holding its breath. Samuel and Catherine didn't sleep. They prepared. They cleaned and loaded every firearm in the house, his father's old Winchester, a shotgun, and the 2 revolvers from the desk drawer. Catherine handled her small Derringer with a practiced ease that sent a chill down his spine. She was no stranger to this. "He'll send his sons first," Samuel said, watching the eastern sky begin to pale. "Elijah and Caleb. They'll try to make it look like they're just checking on the herd. They'll expect me to be gone. They'll try to get inside the house." "And the Hutchins brothers?" Catherine asked, her voice low. "Morrison is arrogant, but he's not stupid. He won't use his own men for the dirtiest work. He'll have told the Hutchins that you're here, alone and unprotected. He'll send them in from the west after his sons have secured the house. He'll let them have their revenge. And when the killing is done, he'll ride in with the sheriff, playing the hero who discovered the terrible scene. It was a perfect plan, vicious, clean, and it would leave him with the land, free and clear. But they knew it was coming. They barricaded the windows, leaving small gaps to shoot through. They set up positions in the house, covering all angles. The waiting was the worst part. The minutes stretched into hours. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill. And then he saw them. 2 riders coming in slow from the east, just as he'd predicted. Elijah and Caleb Morrison. "They're here," he breathed. Catherine nodded, taking her position by the front window. Her face was calm, her hands steady. The brothers rode right up to the porch. They dismounted, their spurs jingling in the dead quiet. They were laughing about something. "Hartley!" Elijah called out, his voice full of false cheer. "You in there? Pa sent us to see if you needed a hand with anything before you head into town." Silence. They exchanged a look. Caleb walked up the steps and tried the door. It was locked. He rattled it, then kicked it hard. "Come on, Hartley. We know you're in there." "Now," Samuel whispered. He threw open the window beside the door and fired the shotgun into the air. The blast was deafening. The Morrison boys dove for cover, pulling their pistols, their faces masks of shock and rage. "It's an ambush!" Caleb screamed. The fight was on. Gunfire erupted from both sides. Wood splintered from the walls of the house. Glass shattered. Samuel and Catherine fired back, a steady, measured rhythm. They weren't trying to kill them. Not yet. Just pin them down. Then from the west, a new sound. More hoofbeats. A lot of them. "The Hutchins," Catherine said, her voice tight. 4 riders came over the rise, rifles out, their faces twisted with hate. They saw the firefight at the house and spurred their horses on, letting out wild yells. Morrison's trap had been sprung, but there was something wrong. The Hutchins gang wasn't riding for the house. They were riding straight for the Morrison boys. A new wave of gunfire erupted, but this time it was chaotic, confused. The Hutchins were firing on Elijah and Caleb. "What's going on?" Samuel yelled over the noise. One of the Hutchins brothers, a big man with a red beard, screamed at Caleb. "Morrison played us. He was never going to let us have the woman. He sent a rider last night, told us to kill anyone on this property, including his own sons. Said he'd pay us double." Caleb's face went white with betrayal. He'd been set up to die by his own father. The two small groups tore into each other with a savage fury. It was a chaotic mess of blood and betrayal. And through it all, Samuel and Catherine could only watch, trapped in the house. This was their chance. The barn, Samuel said. If we can get to the barn, we can get the horses. We can ride for the sheriff. It was a crazy risk. They'd have to cross 50 yards of open ground in the middle of a gunfight. Stay here, he told her. I'll go. No, she said, her green eyes blazing. We go together. They broke out the back door, running low, zigzagging toward the barn. Bullets whizzed past their heads, kicking up dirt. They made it to the barn door, throwing it open and diving inside. The smell of hay and fear filled the air. As Samuel ran to saddle the horses, Catherine took up a position by the door, laying down covering fire. And that's when he saw it. In the corner of the barn, half hidden under a pile of old tarps, was a wooden crate. It wasn't his father's. It was new. And stenciled on the side were 3 letters, TNT. His blood ran cold. And this wasn't just a shootout. Morrison wasn't just planning to kill them. He was planning to erase the entire ranch. Any evidence of the fight, any evidence of his involvement, would be wiped off the face of the earth. He heard a new sound then, above the gunfire. A wagon approaching fast from the south, from the direction of Morrison's ranch. He looked out a crack in the barn wall. It was Jake Morrison, driving the wagon himself. And in the back, more crates of dynamite. He wasn't coming to play the hero. He was coming to light the fuse. But he wasn't alone. Riding alongside him was Sheriff Wallace. His face was grim, his shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. He wasn't Morrison's puppet. He was his escort. The betrayal hit Samuel like a punch to the gut. The law wasn't coming to save him. The law was in on it. They were trapped, completely and utterly alone. The whole county was against them. "Samuel!" Catherine cried out. "The wagon!" He turned back to her, a desperate plan forming in his mind. A plan that was pure suicide. "Get the horses ready," he said, his voice hard as iron. "We're not running." He grabbed a crowbar and pried open the crate. Inside, packed in sawdust, were a dozen sticks of dynamite. He grabbed 2 and the box of blasting caps. His father had taught him how to use them, to clear stumps and rocks from the fields. He never imagined he'd be using them like this. The wagon was getting closer. Morrison and the sheriff were riding with a grim purpose, heading for the house. The firefight between the Hutchkins and the Morrison boys was starting to die down as they ran low on ammunition. Soon all their attention would be on the barn. "When I go," Samuel told Catherine, his eyes locking with hers, "you ride. Don't look back. Just ride as fast as you can to Cheyenne. Tell the U.S. Marshals what happened here. Show them the journal." "No," she said, shaking her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm not leaving you." "You have to," he insisted, his voice cracking. "This story has to be told. My father, he deserves that much. Please, Catherine. For him." He didn't wait for an answer. He took a deep breath, kicked the barn door open, and ran. He ran straight for the wagon. He was a single desperate figure sprinting across the yard, a stick of dynamite in each hand. The surviving gunmen saw him and opened fire. Bullets tore through the air around him. He felt a searing pain in his shoulder, then another in his leg. He stumbled, but he didn't fall. He kept running, fueled by adrenaline and pure, righteous fury. Morrison saw him coming. His eyes went wide with panic. He whipped the horses, trying to turn the wagon, but it was too late. Samuel was almost there. Sheriff Wallace raised his shotgun, his face a mask of cold resolve. He wasn't aiming at Samuel. He was aiming at Jake Morrison. "It's over, Jake," the sheriff's voice boomed over the chaos. "I gave you a chance to walk away." Morrison stared at him, his face contorted in a snarl of disbelief and rage. You were working with him all along?" "His father was my friend," Wallace said, his voice flat. "I made him a promise, that I'd look after his boy." Before Morrison could react, Wallace fired. The shotgun blast threw Morrison from the wagon seat. He hit the ground and didn't move. At the same time, Samuel, stumbling, bleeding, reached the wagon. He lit the fuses. They were short, only a few seconds. He didn't have time to throw them. He jammed the dynamite sticks into the crates in the back of the wagon. Then he dove for the dirt. The world disappeared in a flash of white light and a sound that ripped the sky in two. The explosion was immense. The wagon, the horses, and everything nearby was vaporized. The shock wave slammed into Samuel, lifting him off the ground and throwing him like a rag doll. It flattened what was left of the warring gangs and sent a wall of force that buckled the walls of the barn. Then silence, a ringing, deafening silence. Smoke and dust filled the air. Samuel lay on the ground, his body broken, his ears screaming. Through the haze, he saw figures moving. Catherine running toward him, her face a blur of terror and relief, and Sheriff Wallace walking slowly through the carnage, his shotgun smoking. He had survived. He had won. But as he looked at the smoking crater where the wagon used to be, and the bodies scattered across his land, he knew the price of that victory. The ranch was a ruin. The west pasture was a blackened scar. He had saved his home, but he had destroyed it in the process. He tried to push himself up, but a wave of darkness washed over him. The last thing he saw before he blacked out was Catherine's face, her green eyes filled with tears, her lips forming his name. He woke up to the smell of antiseptic and clean sheets. For a moment, he thought he was dead. The light was soft, filtering through a curtained window. He was in a bed, a real bed. He tried to move, and a jolt of pain shot through his shoulder and leg. He was bandaged tightly. "Don't try to move." He turned his head. Catherine was sitting in a chair beside the bed. Her face was pale and tired, but her eyes were clear. She managed a small, weary smile. "Where?" he croaked, his throat dry. "You're in the doctor's house in town," she explained. "You've been here for 2 days." 2 days. The memories came flooding back. The shootout, the betrayal, the explosion. "Morrison." "Dead," she said simply. "His sons and the Hutchkins, who survived, are in jail. Sheriff Wallace," he told them everything. "The sheriff," Samuel started, still confused. "He was your father's friend. He suspected Morrison from the start, but he had no proof. He was playing a long game, waiting for Morrison to expose himself. Your father's journal was the last piece he needed. When I showed it to him the night before the attack, he put his own plan in motion. It all made sense. The sheriff wasn't a traitor. He was an avenger." "And the ranch?" Samuel asked, dreading the answer. Catherine's smile faded. It's still standing. The house is damaged, the barn is mostly gone, but the land is still there, and it's still yours. The bank loan was declared void. Morrison had coerced your father into signing it under false pretenses. His entire empire is crumbling. The railroad is under federal investigation. Justice, it had been done. His father was avenged. He looked at Catherine, really looked at her. The woman who had appeared in his barn 5 nights ago. The woman who had turned his entire world upside down. "You stayed," he whispered. "I told you," she said, her voice soft. "We go together." She reached out and took his hand. Her touch was warm, solid, real. In the middle of all the death and destruction, she was his anchor. The recovery was slow. The town that had once whispered about him now treated him like a hero. The story of the siege at the Hartley Ranch became a local legend. A story of a young man who refused to back down, who fought a corrupt cattle baron and won. When he was finally strong enough to ride, Sheriff Wallace took him back out to the ranch. It was a mess. Charred wood, splintered fences, the ground littered with the scars of the battle. It was daunting. It was heartbreaking. He stood on the porch, looking out at the ruins of his inheritance. And for a moment, the old doubt crept back in. He was still just a boy. How could he possibly rebuild all this? Then he felt a hand slip into his. Catherine was standing beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's a lot of work," she said. "Too much," he admitted. "Good thing there are 2 of us then," she said, squeezing his hand. "We'll rebuild it. Together. Better than it was before." He looked at her, at the unwavering strength in her green eyes, and he knew she was right. His father had left him 800 acres of unforgiving land, but he had been wrong about one thing. It wasn't the land that tested you, it was the choices you made on it. And his choice from the very first night had been her, The land was just dirt and grass. The home, the future, that was standing right next to him. As the Wyoming sun set, painting the sky not with blood and rust, but with gold and promise, Samuel Hartley knew his fight was over. A new chapter was beginning. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't alone. And that made all the difference. What do you think? Was Samuel right to trust a complete stranger? Or was it a foolish risk that just happened to pay off? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of justice on the frontier, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of the Old West.